Well, I'd argue that the European Convention and the Human Rights Act, which come from it, have had a very, very positive impact on life in the UK. I mean, speaking as somebody who's been a journalist and who still does a lot of freelance journalism, for me, one of the most important things is Article 10, which guarantees, with exceptions, obviously, freedom of expression. You know, people don't seem to realise that before the Human Rights Act came into being, there was no statutory protection for freedom of expression in the UK. Whatever kind of people may have said about England being the home of free speech and all that, it's not really true. Of course, the problem is that there have been so many negative stories about the Human Rights Act put about by the press, which of course is terrified of privacy legislation. It's often difficult to convince people that many, many good things have happened. But let's just take one example. There was the elderly couple who were both in different old people's homes, you know, one for men and one for women. And that was found to be, you know, against the Human Rights Act, and they were reunited. In my view, although I think many in the press would disagree with this, greater protection for people from having their privacy invaded by the press is very important. Thus, Article 8. I mean, the British courts have found it very, very difficult over the years to formulate a tort of privacy, and have in a rather contorted way tried to use confidentiality legislation instead. But certainly the Human Rights Act has helped to give people redress who've had their privacy invaded. Ordinary people, I mean, stars to some extent, yes, as well, but it's very, very important to understand that the press will invade people's privacy, ordinary people's privacy, just in pursuit of a so-called good story. And Article 8 has helped to prevent that, or if not prevented, at least, you know, there have been penalties imposed on newspapers for doing so. So there, I think, are several things which show how good the Human Rights Act has been for people in this country. Well, in the light of Brexit, we're not really sure at the moment what Brexit is actually going to consist of at the time we're doing this interview. You know, people talk about hard Brexits and soft Brexits, but in the event of the hardest possible imaginable Brexit, if we were to completely cast aside the European Convention on Human Rights along with the Human Rights Act, and all the rights that we value would certainly be in jeopardy. We would be, in other words, we would be back to the situation pre-1997. One hopes that whatever kind of new landscape that we have in the UK, that it will be compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. It would be a sad day, I think, if a major European country like the UK was simply to kind of cast aside the notion of human rights. Not only would it be a very sad day for people who live in the UK, it would send the most terrible message out to dictatorial and totalitarian governments around the world, of which, of course, there are far too many. And they certainly don't need encouraging. So, you know, you can imagine someone like Robert Mugabe or Vladimir Putin saying, well, those English, they've got rid of their human rights, why can't we? Yes, there's much talk about having a UK Bill of Rights, and in my view, a Bill of Rights would actually be a good thing. But of course, it depends what kind of Bill of Rights. So, in my view, the Bill of Rights should codify the rights which are already in the European Convention, and maybe go further. In other words, any Bill of Rights should be Human Rights Act plus, not Human Rights Act minus. I mean, I happen to be one of those people who does believe that things are best written down rather than taken for granted, like, for example, the British Constitution, which doesn't really exist in the way that the American Constitution does, for example. So I think that something like the Bill of Rights, which codifies rights further than they have been codified already, would be an excellent idea, providing it's the same as what's in the ECHR or indeed ECHR plus.